my definition of a trade war is when two or more countries, entities that control their own trade policy, decide to look at their arsenal of trade policy tools, and these can be any tools that a government has to impact goods entering, goods and services coming from another country or headed to another country, and try to use those tools in order to achieve political outcomes and apply pressure to another government or set of governments. So ordinarily, governments are always looking to use trade policy to advantage themselves. That's what they're elected to do, and they do so within certain frameworks. Sometimes those policies they enact will hurt somebody else. They will hurt another government. But that is often the byproduct, if that makes sense. Whereas in a trade war, it's the goal. You set out to go, how can I cause this other government economic and political pain using the trade tools at my disposal? And that's what makes it substantively different from just trying to screw each other in getting investment in or trying to get a good free trade agreement. So that's kind of my working level definition. Anna, do you want to kind of expand on that at all? Throw in anything else? Disagree with me violently?
Definitely don't disagree with you violently. I think that's a really good basis for how this works. I think for me, it's when, because I always have to put what's going on into words in a horribly public way with reporting on these things. It's where do I go with escalation of words? So at a range of publications I've worked for, it's been like, when do you use the word war specifically? Because that is a very big word. It implies a long, intense conflict of some kind. And also, when you use war, where do you go from war? Like once you go to using the word war, all of your language then becomes about weapons. It becomes about things like nuclear options. You struggle to escalate beyond the point of using the word war. So when it came to defining when you could call US-China not a trade spat, not a row, when it had to become war, I think it was when you started to get substantial parts of trade being covered by tit-for-tat tariffs. That's when it started to meet the definition of war, when it became an economically meaningful amount of damage being inflicted, or potentially economically meaningful amount of damage being inflicted by either side using the mechanisms of tit-for-tat tariffs. That was when, and it is a very goods-based way of thinking about it. There's other ways to think about it, like denials of visas, etc., which did start to happen with US-China. But traditionally, that's when I'd start to consider something as a trade war, when you get that tit-for-tat process involved. But there can be some, when there's so much trade, when we're talking about different trade partners like UK, EU, when there's also this strange geography, when you start to have goods not moving, and this did actually happen a bit with US-China, right? There were goods held at ports, etc. When you have trade not moving, when you have a visible physical thing happening, then it's harder to move away, to keep things at the spat level. Then it does become sort of a very visual story, and it can become a trade war quite quickly. But I would generally stick to, if you're going to use war, wait till that point and where countries are hitting one another over the head with reciprocal tariffs. That's for me where it reaches that level.
Sam?
So I struggle with this term slightly in that I think it's been slightly devalued, particularly in the UK debate. So I would say that up until now, the UK has not been at any point in a trade war with the European Union. So even right now, where there is a dispute over fishing, even when there have been spats over whether sausages can enter Northern Ireland or not, never at any one of those points was it a trade war. And my view is that, because I agree with Anna, I think a trade war is the pinnacle almost of descriptive language when it comes to these things. You have to be very careful in applying it. And my view would be that you are in a trade war when and there's a kind of, you know it when you see it element to it, but when the gloves are completely off, you are using trade tools to cause significant economic harm, and you are doing so outside of any the legal edifice of any treaty, be it the WTO or a bilateral trade agreement. You are no longer bound by a shared set of understandings and rules, because countries get into disputes all the time over dumping around steel, over interpretations of food safety regulation. And this can lead to tariffs, it can lead to retaliation, but no, that's not a trade war. Trade war is when you push all of that aside and just say, I want to cause you pain. And I think we probably got there with Trump and China in terms of what the actual desired outcome was and how he was using trade policy. But I don't think we've got there between the UK and the EU just yet, and I'm not sure we ever will, or at least I hope not.
I think that this language issue is interesting because there have been a number of the sort of test I apply is, was there a meeting in which people got together, looked at the economy of the other side, and said, here is the change of policy or the political outcome we want. What are the ways we can achieve it? So if you look at, for example, some of the tariffs that the EU applied on the US during the sort of the various back and forward spats when people were throwing around trade war, that wasn't an all-out trade war. But if you look at what the EU targeted, there was a very, there's a pattern there where they said, okay, this is going to hurt people in like the Midwest. This is going to hurt voters in swing states. This will not be entry into final EU products. This is kind of Harley Davidson's. What's iconic? What's going to hurt? So that meeting already, when that meeting is happening, rather than a purely commercial discussion about one side's interests, I think that gets us closer to war. But I think as both Sam, as you both have said, I don't think you're quite there until it really goes gloves off full spectrum. And I 100% agree, the UK and EU have been nowhere, not even in the same continent as a trade war up until now.
Because I'd even say, so with the example you gave of the EU's response to the Trump trade war tariffs, the EU would still arguably claim that the measures it took were consistent with its WTO obligations and were legitimate if you are to consider what Trump did a safeguard, right? So I'm framing this as a question because lots of people disagree with how the EU's framed this, but they would say, and then their approach to the tariffs is actually quite consistent with how countries deal with these sorts of disputes generally. In terms of Boeing Airbus, there was a lot of collateral damage in terms of there were tariffs placed on bourbon, whiskey, cashmere, and that was to achieve a political aim, which was to get those industries annoyed enough to put pressures on their own government to resolve the Boeing Airbus dispute. But even then, I would say, and as you said as well, that's not a trade war. Even with all of that, we're still not quite there yet, because there's still at least an attempt to couch it within agreed legal norms.
I don't want to get into... Sorry. Anna, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's also about escalatory steps, right? So if you're wanting to keep a row fairly niche, you can sort of broaden it out so it includes other bits of the economy, but you're keeping it within certain niches. There might be politically sensitive niches, but you're keeping it in niches. It's when it starts to go to a point of you, as you say, want a certain political outcome that is grander than equalizing trade that you perceive to be unfair, then things start to get escalatory, because you're trying to work out at what point of pressure is that, you're finding someone's pain point at a whole different level. I think that's a good tell. I think we could have seen that with the digital services tax had things gone differently at the OECD, for instance. That would have been an example where things could have got pretty nasty pretty fast.
I want to move off this kind of definitional question again to some of the substance, but I did want to, I guess, disagree with Sam a slight bit regarding this test of legally justified. Not because I have any particular strong view on whether what the EU did was legally justified, but more because, for example, the US would argue that its national security tariffs were WTO consistent. And so if you establish that as the test, I think the the WTO and the existing treaty mechanisms are broad enough that you can get away with a lot of what is in practice feels a lot like a trade punch in the face, while still maintaining legal cover. But I mean, I think that's a fairly sort of, we can go back.
Yeah, and I would couch my legal argument with the other bit of it, which is, you know it when you see it.
Yeah.
And that's much more difficult to quantify or justify in any sort of coherent way. But I feel I've got a fairly good sense for it. But then other people might view it differently.
So what Sam means is he'll know it when he sees it. So if you just follow him on Twitter, he will just let you know.
So as I am the sole arbiter of how you pronounce certain treaties, I also want to have the role of declaring whether something is a trade war or not. So whenever there's a trade dispute, I will either tweet not a trade war or a trade war, and I think everyone should just go off that.
A whole host of like trade journalists gathered outside your apartment waiting for white or black smoke.
Yeah.
Like,
that's what I'd like anyway.